The jasmine was still blooming when the bombs began to fall. Sergeant Thomas McAllister stood on the hillside above Repulse Bay and watched the Japanese planes darken the morning sky like locusts. It was December 8th, 1941, and he had been in Hong Kong for exactly 18 days. Back in Nova Scotia, his mother was probably knitting by the fire, unaware that her son was about to enter hell. The Royal Rifles of Canada had arrived in November, nearly 2,000 young men from Quebec and the Maritimes, sent to reinforce a colony that military planners privately called indefensible. They had no tanks, no air support. Their training had been incomplete, rushed through in a desperate attempt to show the empire that Canada stood ready. Mac had tried to prepare his platoon for combat, but how do you prepare boys for something you have never seen yourself? The first Japanese shell struck Kai Tak Airfield and destroyed every plane on the ground within minutes. Mac watched the distant explosions and felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was not going to be the garrison duty they had promised. This was going to be a slaughter. For the next 17 days, the Canadians fought with everything they had. Mac's company was assigned to Wong Nai Chung Gap, a critical pass through the hills that the Japanese needed to split the island's defenses. The fighting there would become legendary, though Mac never thought of it that way. He thought only of keeping his men alive for one more hour, one more minute, one more breath. The Japanese attacked at night, swarming up the hillsides in waves that seemed endless. Mac fired his Lee Enfield until the barrel burned his hands. When his ammunition ran low, he fixed his bayonet and fought in the darkness, stabbing at shadows that screamed in a language he did not understand. A boy named Corporal Tremblay died in his arms, shot through the throat while trying to reload. Mac held him as the blood poured warm over his fingers, whispering lies about how everything would be fine, how help was coming, how his mother would be proud. Help never came. The British headquarters was overrun. The water supply was cut. Refugees flooded the streets, while Japanese artillery turned the city into rubble. Mac saw things that would wake him screaming for the rest of his life. A hospital bombed with patients still inside. Nurses bayonet as they tried to protect the wounded. Civilians machine-gunned as they fled toward the harbor. But on Christmas morning, the guns finally fell silent. Hong Kong had surrendered. Mac learned this when a Japanese officer walked into his position under a white flag and informed him that further resistance was futile. His company had started with 120 men. 43 were still alive. Most of them were wounded. Mac was carrying Lieutenant Morrison through the burning streets when the Japanese patrol found them. Morrison had taken shrapnel in both legs and could not walk. Mac had been carrying him for 3 miles, refusing to leave him behind despite the orders to retreat. His arms shook with exhaustion. His uniform was soaked with blood that was not his own. When the Japanese soldiers surrounded him with their rifles raised, he did not drop his burden. He did not raise his hands. He looked at the officer in command and spoke 3 words that would change both their lives. He needs help. Captain Yamamoto Kenji had fought in China. He had seen prisoners before, broken men who begged for mercy or screamed defiance until they were silenced. He had never seen a man like this one, a man who stood in the ruins of defeat and demanded compassion for his comrade. Something in the Canadian's eyes disturbed him, a light that refused to go out despite everything. Against his own regulations, Yamamoto ordered both prisoners taken to the medical station. He told himself it was practical, that prisoners had intelligence value. He knew it was something else. Mac was marched through the shattered streets. A small Chinese girl broke from the crowd and pressed a piece of bread into his hand. A Japanese private raised his rifle, ready to punish this act of mercy. Mac caught the girl's eyes and shook his head slightly. She understood. She ran. The soldier hesitated, then lowered his weapon. Yamamoto watched this small exchange and felt the first crack form in his certainty. These Canadians did not fight like the enemies he knew. They fought for something he could not name, something that frightened him more than any weapon. The column of prisoners disappeared into the smoke. Behind them, Hong Kong burned. Ahead of them lay years of suffering that none of them could imagine. But in that moment, walking through the ashes of a fallen city, Mac felt something that surprised him. Not despair, not rage, something quieter, something that would keep him alive through everything that was coming. He felt the bread in his palm, still warm from the girl's hand, and he understood that kindness could survive even this. The war was just beginning. The flies came first. They found the open wounds before the doctors did, laying eggs and flesh that had no medicine to heal it. Mac learned to pick maggots from his friends' bodies with steady hands and a voice that never trembled, even when the screaming made him want to run into the barbed wire and let the guards finish what the war had started. Shamshui had been a British barracks before the fall. Now, it was a cage for 10,000 broken men, crammed into buildings designed for a fraction of that number. The Japanese provided almost nothing. A cup of rice per day, water that bred disease, and guards who answered questions with rifle butts. Within weeks, men began to die. Dysentery first, then diphtheria, then beriberi as the malnutrition set in. Mac watched strong young soldiers waste into skeletons, their eyes going dull before their hearts finally stopped. The Canadian prisoners organized themselves around survival. Officers tried to maintain military discipline, insisting on salutes and proper address, even as men collapsed during roll call. Mac thought this was foolish, but he understood the impulse. Structure was the only thing standing between them and madness. He created his own structure. Every morning, he walked through the barracks and checked on the sick. Every evening, he divided whatever extra food he could find among those who needed it most. Every night, he told stories of home to men who would not live to see it again. Captain Yamamoto was reassigned to the camp in March 1942. He told himself it was a routine posting, that overseeing prisoners was honorable work. He knew it was punishment for something, though he was never told what. Perhaps someone had reported his mercy at the surrender. Perhaps the generals simply wanted him far from the front lines where his doubts could not infect others. He observed the prisoners with clinical interest at first, cataloging their weaknesses as evidence of Western decadence. But the more he watched, the more confused he became. These men should have been broken. They had lost everything: their freedom, their health, their comrades, their hope. Yet every morning, the Canadian sergeant walked among them like a shepherd among sheep. He shared his own ration with the dying. He sat with men in their final hours and sang songs in a language Yamamoto did not understand. He maintained something that looked impossible under the circumstances. He maintained dignity. One day, Yamamoto summoned Mac to his office. The Canadian stood at attention, his uniform hanging from bones that showed through his skin. His eyes were sunken but clear. Yamamoto demanded to know the source of his strength. Mac's answer haunted him for years. "We are fighting for something worth dying for." "Are you?" Yamamoto struck him across the face. Mac fell, then rose without a sound. He did not fight back. He did not look away. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Yamamoto dismissed him with a wave, but that night he could not sleep. The question echoed in his mind like artillery fire. What was he fighting for? The emperor? The empire? He could no longer remember why these things had once seemed worth so much death. The prisoners' resistance took subtle forms. When ordered to sign statements denouncing the British Empire, Mac organized a quiet protest. The men signed with false names, fictional characters from books and films, jokes that the guards could not understand. This small victory spread through the camp like medicine, healing wounds that no doctor could reach. For one moment, they were not victims. They were men who had outwitted their captors. Summer brought disease in waves. The camp hospital overflowed with dying men. Mac contracted dysentery himself and lay in the barracks for 2 weeks, drifting in and out of fever dreams filled with Nova Scotia winters and his mother's voice. He survived only because his friends cared for him as he had cared for them, forcing water between his lips and keeping the flies away from his weakened body. When he could walk again, he learned that 23 men from his original company had died while he was sick. He did not weep. He had forgotten how. Instead, he went back to work, checking on the living, sitting with the dying, telling stories of home. In September, the guards discovered a hidden radio that prisoners had built from stolen parts. 10 men were selected for execution. Mac stepped forward and claimed full responsibility. knowing he would die, but hoping to save the others. The guards dragged him toward the wall. He closed his eyes and thought of the ocean. The shots never came. An officer arrived with new orders from Tokyo. The prisoners were needed for labor. Mac was thrown back into the barracks, alive but changed. He understood now that death was not the worst thing that could happen to him. The worst thing would be losing the part of himself that still believed kindness mattered. That night, he shared his rice with a dying private who could not chew. Outside, the war continued. Inside, a different kind of battle had already been won. The darkness in the cargo hold was so complete that Mac could not tell if his eyes were open or closed. 300 prisoners had been forced into a space designed for freight, packed so tightly that men could not sit without crushing the man beside them. The air was thick with sweat and fear and the smell of bodies that had not been washed in months. Somewhere in the blackness, a man was praying. Somewhere else, a man was weeping. Mac stood perfectly still and listened to the ship's engines rumble beneath his feet, carrying them toward a fate none of them could imagine. The Hell ships, as survivors would later call them, were Japan's solution to a labor shortage. As the war dragged on and Japanese men went to fight, the empire needed workers for its mines and factories. Prisoners of war would fill that need. They were loaded onto transport ships with no ventilation, no sanitation, and barely enough water to keep them alive. Thousands would die in these floating coffins, suffocated or starved or killed by American torpedoes that could not distinguish between enemy vessels and prison ships. Mac had survived 2 years in Shamshui, Pa. He had watched over 100 friends die from disease and starvation and despair. He had been beaten, starved, worked until his bones showed through his skin. But nothing had prepared him for this. The hold was madness made physical. Men screamed and clawed at each other in the darkness. Some went insane within hours, their minds cracking under the pressure of the heat and the fear and the endless black nothing that he moved through the chaos like a blind man, following voices, reaching out with hands that trembled from more than weakness. When he found a man in panic, he spoke calmly about Canada, about snow and forests and cold, clean air. When he found a man too weak to stand, he helped him lean against the hull and promised that this would end. He did not know if it was true. He said it anyway, that on the third day, the ship's water supply failed. The guards lowered a single bucket into the hold twice a day, not nearly enough for 300 men. Mac organized a system. The sick would drink first, then the weak, then everyone else. He enforced it with nothing but his voice and the respect he had earned over years of suffering. Men who had been ready to fight for every drop lined up quietly and waited their turn on the 5th day. The American submarines found them. The first torpedo struck a ship in their convoy, and the explosion lit the hold through cracks in the deck above. Men screamed as the distant vessel broke apart. Then the second torpedo hit their own ship, and the screaming became personal. The hull buckled but did not breach. Water began seeping through damaged plates as the ship listed hard to port. Above deck, Mac could hear Japanese sailors shouting orders and voices ragged with fear. Then the hatch opened and a guard appeared, silhouetted against gray sky, his rifle aimed into the hold. His hands were shaking. His orders, Mac knew, were to kill the prisoners if the ship was sinking. Mac pushed forward through the crowd until he stood directly below the hatch. He looked up at the guard and spoke in the broken Japanese he had learned in the camp. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded against his ribs. "If you shoot us, you drown too. Let us help with the pumps. We all live." The guard stared at him. Time stretched like something about to snap. Then the rifle lowered. The guard shouted something to his companions, and suddenly prisoners were being pulled up through the hatch into the burning daylight, handed tools, pointed toward the flooding compartments. For 12 hours, prisoners and guards worked side by side. Mac pumped water until his arms gave out, then pumped some more. He passed buckets to men who had beaten him, who had starved him, who had watched his friends die and done nothing. In that moment, none of it mattered. Survival was the only flag that anyone saluted. When dawn came, the ship was still afloat. The convoy had been scattered across 50 miles of ocean, half its vessels sunk or limping. But they were alive. Max sat on the deck and watched the sun rise over water that stretched endless in every direction. A Japanese sailor sat beside him, too exhausted to maintain the proper distance between captors and prisoners. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Somewhere in Tokyo, Captain Yamamoto read the report of the submarine attack. He read about a Canadian sergeant who had saved a Japanese guard's life and organized prisoners to rescue the ship. He sat in his office for hours, staring at the words until they blurred. Then he opened his private journal and wrote a single sentence that he would never show anyone. "We cannot defeat a nation that produces men like this." The ship reached Nagasaki harbor 3 days later. Mac was the first prisoner off. He carried the body of a friend who had died in the hold, a man named Corporal Gagnon who had shared his water ration with a stranger. Mac would not leave him on the ship. He carried him down the gangplank and onto Japanese soil, and the dock workers who watched did something that surprised everyone, including themselves. They bowed. The cold dust turned everything black. It filled Mac's lungs, coated his skin, settled into the creases of his face until he could no longer tell where the darkness ended and his body began. He worked 12 hours a day in the mines of Kyushu, swinging a pickaxe that grew heavier with each passing month, descending into tunnels where cave-ins killed men without warning, and the air itself seemed to resist being breathed. At WWII 1945, he weighed 93 pounds. His bones pressed against his skin like tent poles. His hair had fallen out in patches. His teeth were loose from malnutrition. But his eyes, the guards noticed, had not changed. They still held that strange light that Yamamoto had seen in the burning streets of Hong Kong 4 years earlier. The war was dying. Everyone knew it, though no one spoke the words aloud. American bombers filled the sky almost daily now, their silver bodies glinting in the sun as they passed overhead towards cities that were running out of things to burn. The guards grew thinner and more desperate. Their families were starving in the cities. Their sons were dying on islands whose names meant nothing. The empire they had been promised was crumbling into ash. Mac organized the prisoners one final time. Not for resistance, but for survival. He taught them to steal food without being caught, to hide medicine from guards who would confiscate it, to create a network of small kindnesses that kept men alive when everything suggested they should die. He had learned something in the camps that the Japanese had never intended to teach him. That cruelty could be outlasted, but only if you refused to let it make you cruel in return. One evening, he found a young guard named Takashi weeping behind the barracks. The boy, for he was barely more than that, had received a letter. His entire family had been killed in the firebombing of Osaka. His mother, his sisters, the grandmother who had raised him while his father fought in China. All gone, reduced to ash in a single night. Max sat beside him without speaking. There was nothing to say. After a while, Takashi looked up at the man he was supposed to hate, the enemy prisoner who represented everything that had destroyed his world, and asked a question that had no answer. Why? Mac thought of all the men he had watched die. The friends whose names he whispered to himself at night, so he would not forget. The boys who had called for their mothers in the darkness of the cargo holds. He thought of the Japanese soldiers he had killed in the hills above Hong Kong. Men who had probably been just like this weeping guard. Men who had families and dreams and fears that ended when his bayonet found them. There was no sense in any of it. There never had been. "I do not know," Max said, "but you are still alive. That has to mean something." Captain Yamamoto arrived at the camp in July 1945 for what would be the final inspection. He barely recognized the proud officer who had struck Mac in Shamshui-pa. This man was thin and gray, his uniform hanging loose on shoulders that had forgotten how to carry authority. The war had broken him, as it had broken everything else. He found Mac in the mine and asked to speak with him alone. They stood in the darkness together. Two men who should have been enemies, but had somehow become something else, something that had no name in either of their languages. "Why do you not hate us?" Yamamoto asked. Mac considered the question. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the mountains. Or perhaps it was bombs. It was hard to tell anymore. "Hate is heavy," he said finally. "I'm already carrying too much." Yamamoto nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, creased and faded from years of handling. A little girl smiled at the camera with eyes that looked like her father's. My daughter, Yamamoto said. I have not seen her in 4 years. I do not deserve to see her again. Mac looked at the photograph. He thought of his own family, the mother who might still be knitting by the fire, the brothers who might be fighting in Europe, the village that might or might not be waiting for him to come home. When this ends, Max said, and it will end soon, you have a choice. You can die with your empire, or you can live for her. The bombs fell in August. First Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. Mac heard the explosions from the mine and felt the earth shake beneath his feet. He did not know what had happened, only that something had changed, something fundamental, something that could not be unchanged. When the Emperor's voice crackled over the camp radio, announcing surrender in words that no Japanese citizen had ever expected to hear, Mac walked out of the barracks and stood in the sunlight. He closed his eyes and felt the warmth on his face. Behind him, men were weeping, some with joy, some with grief, some because they had forgotten what freedom felt like. Yamamoto appeared one final time, dressed in civilian clothes. He had deserted. He carried nothing but the photograph of his daughter. You were right, he said, about everything. Mac nodded. He extended his hand. Yamamoto hesitated, then took it. Their grip lasted longer than either of them expected. Go home to your daughter, Max said. Teach her to build instead of destroy. Yamamoto bowed, and when he rose, there were tears on his cheeks. He turned and walked away without looking back. Mac watched him go until he disappeared into the crowd of displaced humanity that filled the roads of a defeated empire. 3 months later, Mac stepped off a ship in Vancouver. He weighed 112 pounds. He never spoke of the war to anyone except his wife, late at night when the nightmares came. He fished the waters off Nova Scotia until he was 74 years old, and when he died, his family found a letter in his desk from a Japanese man named Yamamoto. You showed me, the letter said, that strength is not violence, and mercy is not weakness. Japan did not lose to bombs. Japan lost a man like you. The sea carried him home.